This is 14:27 Hrs GMT on Monday, the 27th of July 2020. This is the second edition of the KhoodeelaarTV channel seminar. And this is going to be a short introduction to the Khoodeelaar campaign supporting the project called End Hunger at Root. End hunger at root will be, of course, elaborated on and detailed and introduced at length and updated on every so often, depending on the progress of the campaign and the call for support. Basically, End Hunger at Root dates back to my broadcast on the UK mainstream television channel, Channel 4 News, Slot. The slot used to be broadcast after the 7 p.m. UK time news on Channel 4. And that was the edition that I wrote and presented on the occasion of the then imminent session of the United Nations Organization, which was going to be presided over by then UK Prime Minister John Major. So that was January 1992. I wrote and presented the slot edition. And my argument was that John Major should not overdo the obsession with other countries having nuclear weapons. Although nuclear weapons is dangerous and absolutely unacceptable and lethal and not necessary in the world, the project that the UK government was presenting to the world against nuclear weapons was a shallow one, and it had no independent deterrence of its own against the powers that it wanted not to have nuclear power or nuclear capability. I said that the best and the most important argument for British role in the United Nations and the world stage and for humanity was to address the issue of hunger. So remember, that was 1992, January 1992, when I wrote and presented this program slot following the Channel 4 news at 7 p.m. That was literally the day before or 2 days before John Major was due to address the United Nations as then President of the United Nations General Assembly, because Britain was in turn slotted in as the president of that session. And I said that John Major should use that opportunity to address the imminent danger of hunger driving people from Asia and Africa to go to or migrate to or come to Western Europe. I said that in January 1992. Now that was 28 years and 5 months ago. And in the 28 years and 5 months, the world has seen dramatic, unprecedented surge of migration towards the West from Africa and Asia. Now, I wrote that script in a hurry in about 1 hour in January 1992, and there was no evidence in front of me of actual catastrophic numbers of people being made homeless by wars, by famine and lack of food, and all the other things that happened in the time since I broadcast that call to John Major and to the world. Now, I'm obviously not quoting from what I had written or broadcast, but it can be checked easily from the archives of Channel 4 News. And what essentially I said, and what I have said in the 28 years ever since, is that the population of the hunger and famine ridden areas, or people suffering from famine and hunger in Africa and Asia, would have no alternative but to try to find the solution to the hunger and famine by going to the West. And the details of the surge and the upsurge is being recorded daily now for the last almost 20 years because of the beginning of the catastrophic move towards the West, exacerbated and aggravated by the attacks on Iraq and other parts of the world by the imperialist regimes in place in Britain and in the USA, and colluded and collaborated on by the then EU administration and the NATO allies. And so therefore what we are looking at 28 years on is that hundreds of millions of people are suffering from hunger and famine in Asia and Africa, mainly due to war and mainly due to the fact that in the domestic economies, domestic societies, there is no accountability, there is no proper regard for lives and livelihoods and human rights in the particular countries by their particular governments controlling the country's powers. And the Western powers, the imperialists, that actually caused the attack on Iraq and Libya and murdered these leaders on the pretext that these leaders were dangers to humanity and human safety and the safety of the world. These same powers or their successors, tokens in the countries of the so-called democratic musical chairs, they have not addressed the issue of the hundreds of millions of people being exposed to hunger and starvation and famine and being left with no option but the impulsion, very serious impulsion, desperation to move away from those areas, their homes and their loved ones and the relations, in desperate search for food and safety in the West. And in the process, hundreds, hundreds of thousands have died, literally died in the seas and the oceans. And none of the Western countries, the imperialists or the propagandists, have actually made a big issue to stop the hunger and famine. In fact, they have made the main issue to stop the victims of hunger and famine from getting any relief, any remedies, any respite, any shelter, and that is where the crisis is. So therefore what I'm saying is that it is no good talking about hunger and famine in the vacuum where there is no action by the world body, the United Nations. The current Secretary General, who has been in place for the last few years, Antonio Guterres, is one of the most efficient self-seekers that has occupied that post since it was created in the late 1940s. Now he issues a spin and spiels about how concerned he is and how, by extension, concerned the administration of the United Nations is about the plight of the victims of various discrimination and inequality. But Guterres has failed, absolutely failed, to hold to account the main decision-making powers that affect the human rights of the people in Africa and Asia, hundreds of millions of people, because of the lack of domestic accountability, domestic proper government, proper democracy, and of course, the lack of real accountability by the Western countries that claim to be making aid available to these countries. And that is not even to begin, even before beginning to talk about Yemen and other places where active program of massacres and genocides are taking place, and the United Nations is playing a complicit role of silence. And I counter silence this daily, almost daily ritualistic tweets and other social media propaganda by Anthony Gatteris. He publishes platitudes expressing solidarity with the victims of all kinds of inequality and disenfranchisement and violations of human rights. And he accuses all kinds of other unnamed people of not having adhered to the aims and purposes of the United Nations and its founding agencies. And I'm saying that both the United Nations Secretary General and his other co-bureaucrats are guilty of complicity with the violations of basic fundamental human rights, and they should be prosecuted for complicity in accordance with the existing current various declarations of the United Nations itself. Now, of course, that will not happen, but I'm making the point in order to emphasize the seriousness of the issue of negligence and lack of functionality. The United Nations is a dysfunctional organization, and it is dysfunctional in more cases than it is functional. And various allegations have come from time to time about various United Nations agencies being guilty of raping people in the vulnerable areas that they're supposed to be policing. So that is actually a tip of the iceberg. And I'm saying that the structure of the United Nations itself is unfit to save human beings and protect people from being violated and murdered and massacred by war and by hunger and famine, because the United Nations is not united organization for the peoples. It is a united um, conglomeration of states and regimes. When the states and regimes are at war against their own people in their own territories, there is no way that these states and regimes will be delivering justice to the victims of their torture and their programs of denial and deprivation. So the forum that needs to exist and come to being immediately is an independent forum of world people, activists, and campaigners against poverty and hunger. Now, this call to end hunger at root is, of course, going to be based in particular areas depending on the accessibility of information that the organizers can obtain at the beginning, but it will be aimed at spreading right across the world and to cut across the bureaucracy and the barriers that the United Nations has created and has been colluding in creating when the barriers have been caused by others, like the regimes, successive right-wing regimes in place, in power, in places like the United States. And the last major anti-United Nations aims and purposes president was Ronald Reagan. Reagan began a crusader-like series of calls for the scrapping of UNESCO, and this is something that he did for political reasons. And despite the fact that the United States was still a signatory to all the treaties, major treaties, including the treaties that enabled the continuation of the UNESCO. Now, the UNESCO is an example, just a tip of the iceberg of the disengagement from the aims and purposes it was set up to achieve. Disengagement by the United States, and by example, the United States was sending the message that the UNESCO was a bad thing. And the objective evidence is the UNESCO was doing more positive things than negative things, contrary to what Ronald Reagan claimed. And of course, the current incumbent in the office of the President of the United States is Donald Trump. He absolutely does not want any world cooperation for human rights, full stop. He is the antithesis of the United Nations aims and purposes. And he has been responsible for causing additional hunger, poverty, deprivation, lack of shelter, humanity, and compassion in the last 4 years. So what the world needs is a forum, for a start, to hold to account all those who claim to be giving help to alleviate poverty and hunger, but actually to maintain a proactive program of activities that educates the local people, empowers the local people, and gives them energy and confidence to use the existing available resources in their own land, in their own home countries, and to hold to account the regime locally, regionally, and centrally in each of the countries where most of the people's human rights to food and shelter are being violated. So we are starting this as a beginning, and hopefully it will fill the gap that has been widening, existed and has been widening for the last 70 plus years since the United Nations was set up, with all its aims and objects remaining as valid today as they were at the time of the foundation, but they were not being implemented. With the distance of time, the distance from the aims and objects, the distance between the aims and objects and the member countries has increased manifold, and that increase has been led by imperialist warmongers and violators of the very treaties that their countries have been signatories to. So this seminar launch of this appeal and this claim and this updater short is ending at 14:44 hours GMT on Monday, the 27th of July 2020. Of course, this appeal will be updated in due course regularly, and other versions, other editions of the seminar will be recorded and broadcast in due course. Khuda Hafiz, thank you.